So hypothalamus is structurally placed above the pituitary, and hypothalamus controls the pituitary. So hypothalamus will cause the release of releasing hormones as well as inhibiting hormone. This whole axis is called as hypothalamo-hypophyseal axis. Now hypophysis is the other name for pituitary. So if you understand this axis, the regulation becomes very easy. So the hypothalamus will control the pituitary. Pituitary controls other target glands, endocrine glands. Okay, so this axis is first, the topmost is the hypothalamus, then the pituitary, then the target endocrine glands. Now how does this cycle work? So the hypothalamus first releasing as well as inhibiting hormones, which affects the pituitary. Pituitary will release tropic hormones, and this tropic hormones will affect the different endocrine glands. Okay, this endocrine glands will release different hormones, and these hormones will cause feedback inhibition at the level of the hypothalamus or at the level of the pituitary or at the level of the gland itself. Now we'll start with hypothalamus. I said that it causes the releasing as well as inhibitory hormones. Now which are the releasing and inhibitory hormones? So first is it causes the release of growth hormone releasing hormone. Now what does this growth hormone releasing hormone do? The growth hormone releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary. Now pituitary has two parts, one is the anterior pituitary, another is the posterior pituitary. So growth hormone releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary and will cause the release of growth hormone. Now growth hormone, once it is released, growth hormone, the name itself, it causes growth and development. So it acts on liver and other tissues and produces somatomedins. So somatomedins are a group of growth factors, an old name. Somatomedin is an old name. So under that you have insulin-like growth factor 1 and 2. So this insulin-like growth factor 1 and 2 is the one which brings about the actual physiological effects. So hypothalamus will cause the releasing hormone. So the releasing hormone, the first releasing hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone. So growth hormone releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will release the growth hormone. Okay, so growth hormone will act on the liver and other tissues and produce the somatomedin group of growth factors, which is called as insulin-like growth factor 1 and 2, which brings about the physiological effects. Now there's another thing called as growth hormone inhibiting hormone. It is also called as somatostatin. Somatostatin will inhibit the anterior pituitary. Once it inhibits the anterior pituitary, growth hormone is not released. Okay, so I told you hypothalamus can produce releasing as well as inhibitory substance. So if you take growth hormone, it has releasing hormone as well as inhibiting hormone. The inhibiting hormone is also called as somatostatin. Now the second one is the hypothalamus can release thyrotrophin releasing hormone. Okay, it's a releasing hormone. So thyrotrophin releasing hormone again acts on the anterior pituitary and it produces the topic hormones. All these are topic hormones. This thyroid stimulating hormone. So the releasing hormone is thyroid releasing hormone. The thyroid releasing hormone acts on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will release a topic hormone which is called as the thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone will act on the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland will cause the release of thyroid hormones, which are the thyroid hormones are T3 and T4, iodothyronine and thyroxine. Okay, once again the cycle. So hypothalamus will cause the release of thyroid releasing hormone. It acts on the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary produces the topic hormone which is called as thyroid stimulating hormone, which acts on the thyroid gland, which causes the release of T3 and T4. So the next axis is that of CRH. So hypothalamus causes the release of corticotrophin releasing hormone. Okay, corticotrophin releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary will produce adrenocorticotrophic hormone. Okay, adrenocorticotrophic hormone will act on the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands will cause the release of group of hormones, glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids as well as androgens. Mainly glucocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids are not affected much by ACTH. So cortisol is the main hormone, main glucocorticoids. So when you learn about adrenal gland, you will know about it. So adrenal gland produces three group of hormones: glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids as well as androgen. ACTH mainly affects the glucocorticoid concentration. It can also affect mineralocorticoid, but mainly affects the glucocorticoid levels. So the next releasing hormone is gonadotrophin releasing hormone. So gonadotrophin releasing hormone will act on the anterior pituitary. and it causes the release of two hormones. One is the follicle stimulating hormones, another is the luteinizing hormone. So two trophic hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary. One is the follicle stimulating hormone, another is a luteinizing hormone. So the follicle stimulating hormone as well as the luteinizing hormone, it acts on the gonads. The gonads are the testis and the ovary, and it causes the release of ovarian hormones as well as testicular hormones. Ovarian hormones like estrogen and progesterone, and testicular hormone mainly the testosterone. So this is the axis for the gonadotrophin release. So each one individually is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal axis, and it plays a very important role in regulation. If you look at this picture, the hypothalamus has a direct neural connection with the posterior pituitary, but with the anterior pituitary it is released into the blood. This is the portal system. The pituitary has a portal system. So with the anterior pituitary, the neurons from the hypothalamus you would have learned in nervous system, that's a group of neurons. So this neurons, the hormone, the releasing as well as inhibiting substance are produced in the neurons, and they are released into the blood. So these releasing and inhibiting hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, they are released into the portal blood, and by way of blood it reaches the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the anterior pituitary, and anterior pituitary releases the trophic hormones into the blood, and through the blood it is carried to different endocrine glands. So hypothalamus is a group of neurons which produces these releasing as well as inhibiting hormones. Okay, so these neurons, they release the hormones into the portal system, the pituitary portal system. From the blood it is carried to the anterior pituitary, where it causes the release of trophic hormones, and these trophic hormones are again released into the blood and they get carried to the different endocrine glands. Whereas the relation of hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary is neural. Okay, the nerves which starts in the hypothalamus will end in the posterior pituitary. So long axons from the hypothalamus will go up to the posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus, main two nucleus of the hypothalamus which connects with the posterior pituitary are the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. Supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus. So these two nuclei will carry their axons into the posterior pituitary. So the hormones are produced in this nucleus, and from there they are carried by axonal transport into the posterior pituitary, and in the posterior pituitary they are released into the bloodstream. So the two hormones which are produced by that way is antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay, so these are directly hormones which can directly act on the target tissue, unlike the anterior pituitary where they act on endocrine. There they are tropic hormones which acts on the endocrine gland. These are directly hormones which brings about its physiological effects.